read about what did happen to Jesus in John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. All right. So what's going on? Let's recap what just happened in the story. We'll walk through it. So there's a wedding, and Jesus, his mum, his brothers, and his disciples are all at the wedding. We don't know a whole lot about weddings, Jewish weddings at that time, but they're a bit different for sure than what we have today. So they certainly lasted for a few days and probably up to a week, and you'd have hundreds of people coming into town and leaving and arriving and leaving all throughout the whole week. So it was a big deal, and they ran out of wine. Now, at that time, there wasn't a big drink selection at weddings or in general, so people generally either drank water or wine. The Jewish Talmud writings, which were sort of noted down a few hundred years after Jesus, they note that without wine there is no joy. So running out of wine would have certainly ruined the wedding, and probably definitely been a massive social embarrassment to the family. But it's worse than just a bit embarrassing. In the honor-shame culture of that place and that time, it would have brought significant shame to the family. And more than that, weddings were a big deal, and there was a legal obligation to provide gifts at weddings and to reciprocate meals and invitations and everything at a wedding. So not providing an adequate gift or an adequate meal or adequate wine would have opened the family up to legal action and being sued. So, significant shame, ruined the wedding, financial penalty, legal action. Not a good way to start a marriage, especially if you're maybe a poor couple to start with, and maybe that's why you didn't have enough wine. It's not a good situation. And Mary tells Jesus. So John says that this was Jesus' first miracle, but somehow Mary knew that Jesus was capable of fixing this situation somehow. So I don't know, maybe Jesus' childhood and teenage years were full of miracles that only she knew about. Maybe she just knew that he was special because of the way that he had been born and all of that, who knows. But somehow she knew that she had to tell Jesus about this situation. But Jesus initially hesitates. He says, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come," in verse 4. Now this sounds pretty cold in English, but commentaries tell me that woman, or the word for woman here, was a perfectly polite, normal way to address women in the original Greek. But it is very, very unusual, both in Greek and Hebrew, for a son to address his mother in that way. It wasn't normal at all. So this suggests maybe there's been something of a shift in the relationship between Mary and Jesus. A shift, I guess an inevitable shift from sort of mother-son relationship to this sort of person-God relationship, where Mary has to stop seeing Jesus as just her son and see him as her Lord and King and Saviour. So it's an interesting shift has taken place. And then there's the, "Why do you involve me? My hour has not come." So clearly it wasn't Jesus' responsibility to provide wine for this wedding. And it's also clear he wasn't planning on starting his miraculous works and his signs and wonders and starting his public ministry that night. He knows that doing that will bring on his time. And he says later in the book of John that his time has come when he's going to be crucified. So he knows that this will lead to that ultimate conclusion, and he wasn't quite planning on kicking it off yet. But Mary trusts Jesus. She says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. She doesn't try to micromanage Jesus or control Jesus or tell him where he should get the wine from or what he should do. She trusts Jesus, whatever the outcome. And Jesus does fix the situation. Jesus delivers a big miracle. So Jesus produced between 500 and 700 litres of the very best wine. So that's probably about 800 bottles of normal supermarket bottles by our measures, which even for a giant wedding, multi-day wedding with hundreds of people coming, that's still an awful lot of wine. And it was the very best wine too. The kind of wine the master of the banquet says you would bring out first to impress the guests. Or to put it another way, it's the kind of wine you would get if you visited the McNaught household any day of the week. And it had a big impact. So John says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So let's try and pull out some points to think about through the passage. So firstly, Mary is a really good model for prayer. So Mary saw a need and had compassion on this couple. Mary then took that need to Jesus in faith, knowing that he could do something about the situation. But then Mary trusts Jesus, whatever the outcome. She doesn't try to control or micromanage him. She trusts Jesus. And then Jesus changes his plans. So it seems like he wasn't planning on doing a miracle that night. But because of Mary's request, he changes his plans to accommodate her request. So is this a model for our prayer lives? Is this what our prayer lives look like? Do we see a need and have compassion? Do we bring that need and that request to Jesus in faith? And do we trust Jesus, whatever the outcome, to deal with that situation? And do we believe that Jesus will hear our prayers and change his plans and accommodate our requests as he works in the world? Second thing to think about is that Jesus can act in the little things. So sometimes we think, or I certainly think, that God's probably really busy dealing with all the big world situations. There's lots of bigger issues than my sort of first world problems that I might come across. Sometimes we think that Jesus maybe won't help if it's our fault, or if we've messed up, or we kind of deserve it in some way. Like if you haven't bought enough wine for a wedding, for example. But even when it's a small thing, or even when it is our fault, Jesus can help. So maybe when we're facing social embarrassment or financial penalty, Jesus can help. Maybe you've messed up at work or at school, and you're about to get found out. That's not too small to bring to Jesus. Or maybe you've made a terrible decision and made a fool of yourself, and soon everyone's going to know about it. Jesus can help in that situation as well. We can bring our problems to Jesus and trust that he will help us in his way and in the best way. The next thing is that Jesus gives good gifts. So Jesus didn't give them a little bit of Asda Smart Price wine or a few bottles of Schlur just to get them over to the next day. And he didn't just give them a little bit until someone could run to the shops tomorrow. He gave them an abundance of the very best wine. And we see this elsewhere in the Bible. In chapter 6, so just a few chapters later, Jesus feeds the 5,000. And he doesn't give them just enough or enough till they get home. He feeds everybody, and there's 12 baskets left over. He gives in abundance. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, although you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? Or even in James chapter 1, it says, every good and perfect gift comes from above. I sometimes try to teach the kids not just do the minimum. So you go and ask them to tidy their bedroom, and they'll pick up a sock from the floor and put it on the bed, and that's them tidied their bedroom. And they like to just do the bare minimum, but trying to teach them to go above and beyond and do more than the minimum. Jesus certainly doesn't just do the minimum; he does the maximum. His blessings are never stingy or just enough. He loves to give us the very best and give us life and life in abundance. Final point to ponder is that Jesus knows how to party. So I think it's quite significant that Jesus was at the wedding. You might think he'd be too busy helping the poor and healing the sick and arguing with the religious leaders and doing all the other important things that Jesus did. Why take a few days out of what was quite a short and busy ministry, to go and eat and drink and be merry at a party? Why waste a miracle changing water into wine for people who'd already had plenty to drink, when there was undoubtedly lots of other people around who were poor and homeless and disabled and could really use that miracle an awful lot more? In the same way, I sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable at Christmas time with how much we spend on foods and drinks and parties and decorations and presents, and we spend lots of money celebrating when there's other people that that are in need and definitely need that money more. I don't quite know how to resolve that tension yet, but we can look at the example of Jesus in the Gospels to try and help us resolve that. He wasn't at one extreme or another. He walked this path somehow, which we can try and copy. Now don't mishear me. Jesus is very, it's very clear when you read the Gospels that Jesus is all about helping the poor and being with the sick and the marginalized, and that's what he's all about. And the Bible contains loads of warnings about greed and selfishness and drunkenness. But Jesus also showed that there's a time to celebrate, there's a balance to be struck, and Jesus spent time celebrating. We see this again with when Mary, a different Mary, brings a jar of perfume to Jesus and smashes the perfume and pours it all over his feet. And the perfume's worth, like a year's wages. And one of the disciples, who may have had ulterior motives, said, "No, what are you doing? We could have sold that perfume and given all the money to the poor." And in that situation and at that time, Jesus says, no, like what Mary had done was a good thing. So there's a time for everything. There's a time to celebrate. There's a fine line to be worked out and walked, and we can look at the life of Jesus to try and figure out how to do that. But I don't think Jesus just did this miracle to teach us these things or to help out this couple. John says that this was the first of the signs that Jesus did, and we've talked in other weeks about that word sign and how it's something that points to something or someone greater. So what was Jesus pointing to with this miracle? So the idea of miraculously transforming water into another red liquid would have been really familiar to his Jewish audience. They knew their Torah, and they would be very familiar with the story of Moses, who, with God's power, turned the water in the River Nile into blood in the first plague when God rescued the Israelites from Egypt. And Jesus turning water into wine is a direct parallel and associates Jesus with Moses. And that's not just a new idea that depends just on this part of the story. It says in Deuteronomy, God says in Deuteronomy, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you," talking to Moses, "from among their fellow Israelites, and I'll put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name." And the gospel writers want us to see that Jesus is that new Moses. Moses and the Israelites came out of Egypt. They spent 40 years in the wilderness before crossing through the River Jordan into the Promised Land. In a really similar way, Jesus came out of Egypt as a baby, spent not 40 years but 40 days wandering around the wilderness, and then crossed through the River Jordan in his baptism. So Jesus is the new Moses, and turning water into another red liquid, turning water into wine, just cements that relationship even more. So through this miracle, Jesus is showing us that God is doing something new. So in the same way that Moses turned the water into blood, Jesus turns the water into wine. In the same way that God, in the same way that Moses' first plague that was brought was that miracle, it was Jesus' first miracle was the water into wine. In the same way that God initiated the old covenant through Moses, he's initiating the new covenant here through Jesus. And instead of being a covenant marked by death and judgment and sacrifice, Jesus' death on the cross was that final sacrifice of that old covenant, and it's a new covenant marked by joy and blessing and grace, symbolized by the wine. And instead of freedom from Egypt, it's freedom from our sin and selfishness. So with Jesus' first miracle, he announces the good news of this new covenant and his kingdom. But there's something else, I think, in this as well, and it's something scandalous. I don't know if you spotted it in your first reading of it, but like most things in Jesus' life, this would have really upset the religious leaders of the time, because it wasn't just any water that Jesus used. We read in verse 6, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. So it was these jars that Jesus used for the miracle. This was the water used by the Jews and the Pharisees they would either dip their hands into it or they would pour it over their hands as like sacred water, as to represent their desire to remain pure from the sins of the world. Jesus didn't have to use those water jars. I mean, they're at a wedding and everyone's drinking wine and then they run out of wine. So by definition, there are lots of empties around, lots of containers that would be a much more natural place to put the wine. Jesus deliberately used these ceremonial washing jars. He deliberately devalued a symbol of people trying to get clean with God through their own efforts and their own actions. A symbol of people trying to get clean and pure and right with God on their own, and transformed that for this miracle. That's a little bit like us filling the baptismal pool with champagne for a party, or turning it into a hot tub. If we did that, it would make a big statement about what we thought was important and what we thought wasn't important, what we thought was sacred and special and what's not sacred and special. And that's what Jesus is doing here with this ceremonial hand washing ritual. Canadian pastor Bruxy Cavey says this in his book The End of Religion. Through his first miracle, Jesus intentionally desecrates a religious icon. He purposely chooses these sacred jars to challenge the religious system by converting them from icons of personal purification into symbols of relational celebration. Jesus takes us from holy water to wedding wine, from legalism to life, from religion to relationship. And that's the shift of this miracle. So a challenge for us. What religious things are we trusting in to make us clean? Is it coming to church every Sunday? Is it giving to charities or helping the poor? Is it even having good Bible knowledge? Is that what your hope is in? Or is it being a good person or always trying to do the right thing? These things are obviously not bad things in themselves. In fact, they're all good things in themselves. But they're not going to wash away our sin problem. And they're not going to make our hearts clean in the same way that the Pharisees washing their hands wasn't really solving the problem. Jesus offers us a new covenant, the free and abundant gift of forgiveness and life, He wants to make it clear that we're forgiven and saved by his generosity, his gift, not by our good works and our religious practices. It says in Ephesians, Paul says in Ephesians, "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." Continuing the wine metaphor, Jesus talks elsewhere about the good news of his kingdom and his covenant as being like new wine. He says this in Mark, "No one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." Are you ready to stop your religious rituals and trusting in your own actions, your own efforts, and trust in Jesus' generosity instead? Are you ready to be made new, to be like a new wineskin and accept that new wine from Jesus? One of Jesus' first acts, as we've just read, was to go to a wedding, and Jesus is going to come back again, and the Bible talks about there being a wedding when he comes back again. Talks about the wedding supper of the Lamb in Revelation. And everyone who's received that new life, that new wine from Jesus, will get to celebrate together. And this wedding in Cana that we've been reading about is just a foretaste of what that great wedding feast will be like. The really good news is that we're all invited to that wedding. You're invited to that wedding. If you haven't RSVP'd and accepted yet, then please think about it. Come and chat to me or to someone else afterwards. There's a prayer team around. If you come and sit down near the front at the end, someone would love to chat with you, hear your story, and pray with you about what that means. We're going to have communion in just a second, which is yet another example of wine symbolism that Jesus employed. We take the wine to look back on Jesus' sacrifice on the cross that makes our forgiveness possible. We also take that wine looking forward as a little foretaste of that great wedding feast that we'll have one day when Jesus comes again. Let's pray just now. God, thank you that you went to that wedding in Cana and that you helped out that couple, that family. Thank you that you can help us in our lives. Thank you that you love to give good gifts to us. And thank you for the gift of the new covenant and the forgiveness that you offer all of us. Thank you that it's not our actions or our efforts, it's not how good we are that means we can be with you and we can be in your family and in your kingdom. Thank you that it's all about your generosity and your grace. Amen.